I don't think I come to spread peace and harmony. I come to say some of the things that we found out in a major inquiry, which was rather grandly called The Future of Civil Society. Now, nobody knows what the future's going to hold, and even fewer people know what civil society is. But me and my team of interested people were asked by a group of the biggest charitable foundations in the country to go out in England, and this was only in England for reasons I'll explain in a minute, and ask the question, where are we going next? What's going to happen next? Not to local government and central government, there's loads of people looking at that. Not to the private sector and the market, there's loads of people looking at that. But to this incredibly important area in the middle, which is all of us, when we do things because we're angry or because we want to make changes happen, when we join an allotment society or sing in a choir, join your residents' association because you've had enough of your landlord, set up a new housing co-op or create a rape crisis centre. All of those things that we do because we choose to do it. Not because we have to do it to make a profit, not because we have to do it because the state says we should do it. But we were looking at that range of organisations that go from the tiny local start-up through to some of the biggest household name charities. And the question we asked, what's going to happen next? Now, you can do that by commissioning universities, as Alistair said, to do a piece of what they call futurology. And I've paid for some of those in my lifetime, and I know what you get. You get something which mainly you forget about it, and then 10 years on you think, oh, he was right on that one. And our contention was that wasn't the way to look at the future. The way to look at the future is to listen, just like the aviation industry have been forced to do, to listen really closely to what people themselves think is happening. So we went to 9 localities, did really deep listening exercises. I didn't go around the country talking to people. I went around the country listening very acutely to what people had to say. And remember, we launched this inquiry in the beginning of 2017, a year after that referendum, which I don't know about you, but I know that it shocked the CBI, the TUC, government, Whitehall, all sorts of people who thought they knew best. But it didn't shock people who come from the more overlooked parts of the country. And I say that carefully because I don't mean the poorest parts of the country, the parts of the country that don't feel they have a voice. And what that referendum revealed, wherever you stand on the Brexit decision, was a division in people's hopes and expectations. You could see the places where people voted to leave, whether they were rich or poor, were places where people didn't see a great future ahead of them, and certainly didn't see a future for their children, which is how most of us look at the future, our own children or other people's children. And when I was at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which I was at the time of the referendum, we commissioned some very interesting research about who voted how. And of course, the country divides between the north and the south. We can all play that game. Of course, we are divided on grounds of how much income people have and how much wealth they have. Of course, there's a divide between the experience of people who live in those big, booming cities and people who live on the towns on the outside. Of course, there's a division between people who live in the seaside towns of this country, many of whom face the most difficult challenges, and those who live in Birmingham, Manchester, London, or Leeds. Of course, those divisions were true. And of course, there were divisions on grounds of generation and education. By and large, if you had more than one degree, you were likely to vote one way. Nothing to do with how clever you are, but you were more likely to vote one way. But the biggest single divide was not any of those. It was where you lived. Where you come from, the place you come from determined how people voted. And my really simple take on this is even if you had a PhD and you lived in Hartlepool, you probably voted to leave. That's what the research showed you. You know, all those prospects, but Hartlepool made you feel not much of a future for me here. So when we went out and did this exercise of listening over those 2 years, we saw all those divisions, bitter divisions in some communities. But we also saw something phenomenally important, which was people coming together to do stuff. We didn't go to a single place in the country where the residents in the place, the people who live in the community, whether they were long-standing or new, weren't doing things. They were coming together in that very human desire to do things with our neighbours. So whether it was, running the allotments or putting refugees up at home or campaigning to get the landlord to do something different. There wasn't what you often hear people talk about, cold spots where nothing is going on and everyone's behind their front doors. Actually, everywhere we went, people were actively engaged. But they talked about division, and they mostly talked about control. They talked about how they felt they had very little control where they lived. I am not surprised that that slogan, "Take Back Control," did so well. I don't think it's about the European Union. It may have been for some people, but I think people feel that others have control where they live. And those others might be the government, and we're all used to blaming the government, or waiting for the government to fix it. Or it might be the local authority, and we're all used to blaming the local authority. But it wasn't just those two players. It was also some of the people who you represent in this room. Housing associations were seen by many of the people we talked to as part of the problem in the areas in which they lived. So too were universities. Universities which decide suddenly that actually housing loads of students in one area, even though it inevitably closer to the primary school, is a good thing to do. Universities were seen as a problem. So were the arts organisations who fly in, do something for 2 years and then change their investment priorities. A feeling that people didn't have a sense of control where they live was the biggest single finding that we got in that inquiry. And looking at some of the nods in the room, I think people are not entirely surprised by that. But it wasn't just that the society or the community, or whatever word you want to use, felt divided. They also pointed out to the big divisions in the organisations that they thought belonged to us. The difference between a group of parents fighting really hard for their children with profound and multiple learning disabilities, and the big household name charities that they saw collecting money in all sorts of ways. The difference between the Residents Association and the Housing Association, whose board meetings happened so far away they weren't even sure when they were taking place. The distances within what we grandly call civil society were as great as the differences in the community. And that led us to ask the question, what really matters to you? What really matters and what really worries you about what's happening in the future? And we heard all sorts of things. But we heard some things that I think are of importance to you. We heard that people are more and more worried about where they belong. That they felt, and actually this is true in my experience, that about 15, 20 years ago, at least for most men, and for increasing numbers of women, the place of work was where you belonged. I come from York, people say, I was a railway man, or I worked for Rantries. People can't say that anymore because the world of work has changed. It doesn't give people that sense of belonging and identity because all sorts of jobs, you do it for 6 months, then the company's taken over by somebody else, you're not quite sure who you're working for, it's a short-term contract, you're doing 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. People don't identify with work. And given we know people don't identify with church or chapel or mosque or synagogue in the way they did, that's 2 big bits of identity and belonging that have gone. And people were worried about that. If I don't belong there, where do I belong? And for some people, they felt that their housing estate or the community or the neighbourhood they lived in, they belonged. But as somebody said to me, the estate I live on is owned by 3 different housing associations and they keep changing their names. I've got no idea who they are now. So that didn't really give people a sense of, this is where I belong. The second big thing people talked to us about was about the place they lived in. How proud they were to live in the place, even if they thought it was not great. One young man said to me, I know it's crap here, but at least I know where I am. This is my crap. I know what I'm doing. Don't tweet that. That's not the language I should use. A sense of pride in their place, an identity in their place, whether they'd lived there, their great-grandfather lived there, or whether they'd arrived in the last 5 years. Because although we are all fantastically connected, and because of my phone I can find out what's going on in, I don't know, Mexico today, actually people want to know what they can see and what's close to them. And so their place really matters. And very closely aligned with that, they minded about the spaces where people come together to meet. What do we do in civil society when there's something difficult going on? You know, somebody wants to build a hostel for homeless, mentally ill people on the corner of your street. What do? You get together. You talk it through. What do you do when they close down the bus route to your area? You get together, you talk it through, you take action. And increasingly, people felt that there were fewer and fewer spaces where people could come together and meet. Pubs are now accessible for some people, targeted at others. The community spaces that they used to be, one of the things I said at the beginning of the inquiry was we will never ever meet, sorry Alistair, in a posh hotel. We will only meet in civil society spaces because at least that keeps the money within civil society, we'll pay rent. I've sat in some pretty shoddy places, as I'm sure you all have. And what does that do? A community centre which is leaking, open on a Wednesday evening but not the rest of the time because they can't afford to keep it open, freezing cold. It sends a message that when you come together, it doesn't really matter. When the people who make decisions about you come together, they come together in nice boardrooms. But when we, the people, as they say, come together, we're in some pretty rubbish places because, of course, providing a community centre is nobody's statutory priority. It's nobody's top thing that they have to do. And yet for a community to be strong, you need places where you can meet, talk things over, come together. So places and spaces people talked about. And they talked about the difference that that computer in all your pockets has made. The digital connection, the fact that at a flick of your thumb you can be connected, has brought great benefits. I always say, my late grandmother said to me when I was growing up, when you're a grown-up, Julia, there'll be a computer in every town. There is now a computer in every single pocket, probably in this room. And what that's done is given us some forms of connection. Some ability to know stuff, some ability to find things out. You can Google me as I'm speaking if you want. But people feared it was eroding the connections we have with each other, the human connection, the really important need to be together, to talk stuff through. And linked with that, they talked about, they didn't use this language, the ways in which people are now organising are different from the ways they organised before. That the power of that computer in your pocket is allowing networks of people to get together, to campaign at the touch of a button, to express their views, to find stuff out. And the big, clunky institutions around us are getting used to that rather slowly. So the fact that if you want to, you can find out who's paid what for doing what in which organisation, who's on what board and what are they doing, is now, the expectation is that is much, much more open. And yet the big institutions haven't quite got it yet. And an example I'll give is the big campaign, how many people know here about Southern Health? Southern Hospital? Yeah, where tragic death of some young people who had profound and multiple learning disabilities. Tragic, avoidable, appalling, neglectful, created deaths led some very brave and courageous and very, very angry, grieving parents to campaign almost entirely online and have done deep damage to that institution, I think rightly, because they were neglectful of those children's lives. But actually, you didn't find the big charities, the big campaigning organisations there. It was done by angry, grieving parents. Those changes are real and profound, and they will continue for the long term. So what does this mean for housing? John Land's invitation to me, it made me laugh on the train today. He said, by the time we have this conference, we'll be a bit clearer where we're going on housing policy. Well, it's not clearer where we're going on housing policy at all. But I don't think housing policy is the biggest game in town now. I think the biggest game in town is how we decide to shape the housing in which we live and how we start to make demands. Because we have for too long looked to government to regulate, to decide what's going to happen, to make these big decisions. And Alistair's right. Some of those decisions have changed every year since I can remember. And they haven't, frankly, kept us safe or got us housed or made people feel secure where they live. They have created an enormous amount of activity and noise, and organisations like the one I used to run and HQN do interesting and exciting things. But what really matters about housing is that your home is the single most important thing in most people's lives. Actually, everybody's lives. How do any of us build a life, raise our family, hold down a job, unless we've got security where we live? That thing that is called by housing ministers a unit is actually the home, where you are with the people you love most, occasionally hate most, have your most fun, do the things you care about most. They happen to you at home. And home really, really matters. And I think we've all fallen into this view of it's something about piling up the units, how quickly we build them. You want a place that's safe, dry, affordable, by which I mean cheap to heat, and that you can stay for the long term. Because unless you have those things, we will have no community engagement, because why would you get involved on a 6-month tenancy? We will not raise our children for the next generation safely. And I don't mind whether you're owning or renting or share owning. It's where you live that matters. And the reason this is such a big public policy issue is because your home matters to you so much. The reason that burglaries are such a dreadful crime is because they happen to you at home. And the reason people get so angry when the police, as they occasionally do, downgrade it and say it wasn't really very violent is because actually they've been violated at home. The reason domestic violence is such a hideous, appalling crime is because it breaches the intimacy of home. The reason that what's politely called internal sewage flooding by the water companies is such a catastrophe that there's a 50% higher chance you will suffer a mental health breakdown after it's happened to you, a really big risk, is because it is so devastating to have something awful happen to you at home. This really matters. So the things we heard about in the inquiry and the things I put together from my lifetime in housing suggest to me we need to do some of the stuff we do about housing differently. We need to acknowledge that it is the foundation stone for everybody's lives. It's how we start. And therefore we have to make some different demands and talk differently about what we expect from our landlords. Because I've been to a lot of housing association and local authority housing conferences in my lifetime. And there is a bit of a tendency to talk about the residents as if they are there, the customers. Every housing provider in this country is entirely dependent on their residents for their ability to do their job. If the residents weren't welcoming in new people, keeping an eye on Mrs. So-and-so who hasn't been seen at her door for 3 months, making sure that they complain when those grass verges are still tripping people up and are not safe to walk past, how would the landlords know what was going on? And more fundamentally, even more fundamentally than that, how would they know what's going badly wrong? Now, I've been really sceptical publicly about people using the tragedy at Grenfell to make points. But let's remember that the people who said it was not safe to live in months before that tragedy were the residents. Let's remember that when child sexual exploitation cases were found in some of the northern towns, the people who knew it was going on were the residents, the people who lived in those areas. Let's remember that when gangs, guns and knives start being traded around and real tragedy is afoot, the people who know first are residents. If you are running a housing association or a local authority or a housing co-op, unless you have that intelligence, you are working towards disaster. You're working towards a world where you will simply not be able to run it, because our world is now so complicated that you need all the eyes and ears that are out there. You need people to say to you, have you noticed that you've managed to house a whole lot of people over there who may well need housing, but they're causing havoc? And they need to be able to say it in a considered and careful way, because otherwise havoc will turn into something much more disastrous. So the dependence of our landlords on residents seems to me to be so much more important than whether government decides, do you know what, we'll regulate it this way or that way, or we'll change something this way or that way. How we get that right and how we hear carefully feels to me really important. Which is the reason that we came up at the end of this 2-year inquiry, not with a lot of recommendations to government, and I've been in terrible trouble about this. How could you not tell government what to do? Well, partly, by the time we reported, government had its eyes on other things and wasn't that interested, so that was partly practical. But it's partly that everything we heard suggested it wasn't anybody else's responsibility to fix this. It's how we all behave, what our attitudes are, what our practices are, that will make the difference. And that's why we talked about a PACT, a new way of looking at what we do. And I'm going to go through what the PACT says and what it means. But I want to say first to you that we talked about power, accountability, connection and trust. And I'd say that to your landlords, to housing associations and local authorities. But it's not just for the big providers, it's also for every residents group in town. What we talked about was a new approach to power, to understanding where power lies, really, and understanding where it should lie. And I would say that understanding the real power of residents in any community is an incredibly important part of what you as residents need to do and your landlords need to understand too. Your ability to shape what's happening in your area is in itself powerful, in just the same way that the trade union movement was so fantastically important and powerful. How we recognise where power is, how we shift power where we can, which is not the same as people just washing their hands and saying, it's nothing to do with me, mate. It's understanding how you use power is important for the landlords. But it's also important for every residents' association, because I've worked with a residents' association where power is locked in to 2 or 3 people and they don't pay attention to anyone else either. I don't suppose anyone in this room is guilty of it, but you'll all recognise how that can happen. Residents' groups who get a hotline to the chief executive and therefore think they are so much better than everybody else. Residents' groups which keep other people out and are not welcoming and opening, are weakening their own power, but they're doing it by pretending to consolidate power. So the PACT starts with P for power. It talks about accountability, and by accountability I don't just mean a set of accounts that everybody can understand, but every set of accounts can be made in a way that everyone can understand, and it's unforgivable to have accounts that most bright enough people, all of you in this room, can't understand. But much more than that is how you give an account of what you've done. How you explain what you tried to do and what worked and what didn't work. How you account for your actions. We did this thing. It turned out not to work. How lovely if one of our politicians would just in the next 5 days say that. But we need to get better and cooler at saying that. We need to find it easier to say we tried it. And that's true for residents' associations, and it's true for the big providers as well. An understanding of your accountability and how you tell the story. Believe me, we really made the case that we needed to do something about rents, but we lost, is as accountable as saying, whoopee, look, we've won some small victory. It's incredibly important that people in this digitally enabled age, because remember, they can see right through you now, understand what you're doing and that you are properly held to account. And the C is for connection, because I believe that connection is the enduring purpose of all community organisations, all voluntary organisations and all big institutions. It's how we bring people together. How we have deep personal connections where we talk about difficult stuff. We're not afraid to say that racism is a scar on this country and we are going to do something about it because you are humanly and deeply connected, not because you're shouting slogans on Twitter. Not because you're doing Facebook likes, which somebody accused me of recently. Connection is how we engage over difficult stuff and how we try and find a way through. And sometimes there'll be a resolution and sometimes there won't, and you have to be held to account. We tried our best, we couldn't resolve it. That will happen. But connection matters. And the final word in this strategic look is T for trust. Because the thing we heard time and time and time again is that people don't trust those around them. They don't trust their landlords to provide housing for the next generation. Ben Page from Ipsos Mori always says, if you poll, do you want housing built? People say no. If you say, do you want housing built so the children can stay here? They always say yes. You need to be able to trust your landlords that they're planning for the future. They need to trust you that you will tell them the truth in the right way when it happens, and you won't be scoring political points, you'll be doing it properly. You need to trust each other in your communities. Trust is our biggest currency. And it is the one that is at risk of being devalued. Now, those 4 words could be a handy set of slogans. They could just be some abstract words. What I've discovered since we launched this report a year ago is that across the country, people are finding them useful as a way of analysing what they do. They are a strategic tool that says, are we doing well enough on any of these? I was at a conference in Bristol yesterday of all the major universities who, you may not know this, but are having all sorts of difficulties. They are using it. There are housing organisations who are talking about it. Because we are, and I'll end here, moving into a different world. We're moving into a world where there is going to be extraordinary economic volatility. You might think Brexit is the best thing that's ever going to happen, and it may well be, but it's going to be bumpy. You might think it's going to be fine, and I hope you're right. But there are going to be bumps because we are part of a global economy. What happened in Redcar and Port Talbot with the steel industry, what's happening with other industries now, means we are heading for economic volatility. We have a democracy that is, to be polite, limping along. And we have a social fabric that is torn. If any of you saw the Dispatches programme 2 nights ago, the absolute desperation of people without a safety net. Nobody is going to fix this for us. We argued in the inquiry, and I'm giving it to you, we have to start fixing it ourselves, otherwise we're going to be in even greater trouble. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks.
Janice White from Estuary. Your talk was excellent. I really enjoyed what you had to say. One of the things I observe in comment in regards to listening on the ground, which I think is absolutely right, is the challenge that we have of those of us who want to listen and trying to listen, to make the connections back through all the various complexities of organisations to do what they need to do. So, i.e., we sit and we hear residents talk about what is happening around us, but we need, from the local authority, but a particular department or a number of departments, from the police, from the health, to come together to present to fix this solution, but their focus is on some wider political agenda priority, because we've got, the CCGs and all of those things, that looking at this local issue here, that is a day-to-day issue, is not a priority for them. And I feel like they say to us as landlords, well, you just need to get on and do something with it. And my question is so how do we tackle those things for those who are close to on the ground and listening, and have some limited power, but not sufficient power to influence, to bring those around into local situations? Because I believe big organisations, they work on such a vast strategic level that we have forgotten about locality.
Wow.
If I had the answer, I'd just go like that. It's a really tricky one. Yeah. I think one of the things we experienced was that all the things that used to feel like big institutions that could do stuff have also lost power. So local authorities have lost 40% of their budget. And I think that has been devastating in all sorts of ways. It has also pushed some of them to behaving rather differently, to recognising they can't do it on their own. They are no longer semi-detached and locked in the town hall. They have to get out and work with you. Now, I don't know which local authority you're talking about. I don't really want to know, because I'll muddle it up anyway and say the wrong thing and get into trouble. I think what matters is how we make common cause, and how... Are you from a residents' association or from a...
I'm from the landlords.
I thought that's the way your question was framed. I just wanted to say the right thing. How landlords make it clear that you have a shared interest here. That actually there is no longer a separation between we provide the housing and you provide the care, because the housing will fall to pieces unless the care comes in. And it feels to me that we're at quite a radical moment in how we plan for localities. Matt may say more about this later, because he's done lots of work on it, about how we think differently about how we set priorities in neighbourhoods and communities. And some of the best local authorities are doing that better than others. I think we need to make them compete with each other. I think we need to find more cleverer ways of catching their attention. But some of it is about recognising that we have a shared responsibility. We're not just saying to them, it's over to you. We're saying between us, we're going to find a way of fixing it. Roundabout way of answering a really interesting question.
Sorry, I thought I had
I heard
this. Sorry. Well, you go and make a decision, man. We'll come to you in a second, yeah?
Good morning. Thanks very much. I enjoyed your speech. That certainly stirred up a lot of thoughts for me. Why am I not surprised in the main sort of gist of your speech? In my opinion, we live in a class-ridden society where many decisions about individuals and groups are made on people's race, culture, sexuality, age, etc., etc., etc. So I'm not really surprised. The thing which, and I'll get to my question, the thing which touched me was the part you talked about, the care networks on estates. I call it the informal social care networks. I've been banging on about this in my local authority, Hackney Council in London, for a couple of years now, because all that informal activity is just not recognised. That's just taken for granted. And as you say, we just get on with it, yeah? The question that I wrote, I went to another conference, and there was a speaker, her name was Dr. Juliet Davis, and she's done international research project on this particular area, which I found absolutely fascinating, and a whole range of examples in the UK and across the world. How do you think we can actually gain from all that experience, put it on the agenda with local authorities and housing trusts, and use that as a way of actually empowering residents on the estate to change policy and change direction?
Well, I'd start by saying that the issue of what's sometimes called the informal care network, sometimes that's called that's just what we do round here, is the thing that keeps our entire society going. That without it, no hospital would survive, no local authority, social service department would survive. And there are risks to it, because one of the risks, it becomes sort of colonised and used. And whenever I talk about this, and I've done quite a lot of work on informal networks, you worry that somewhere in the room someone's saying, that's good, that's cheap, we'll have some of that. And actually there's a very real risk. I mean, the burden on local networks of that sort, just to use that term, is greater than it was. My only feeling about that is that the assets we hold in communities, Cormac Russell, let's get his name wrong, Cormac Russell has done masses of work on asset-based development. We need to be conscious of what we hold and how precious it is, and recognise how easily it can be eroded by forces outside. One way of breaking an informal network is to give it too much to do. The other way of doing it is just to badmouth the people involved in it. And we've all seen this happen. And dismiss it. But the strength of those networks is, of course, what you do. Caring for people who come out of hospital, being nice to somebody who's moved into the neighbourhood. That is worth so much. But the second strength is you know so much. It's the knowledge that is held in those networks. And I think that goes back to the earlier question from you, from Estuary. That knowledge is gold dust. And you own it. You have power because you know stuff that's going on. And my little litany of things I knew, I'd add to it. I think about Grenfell and child sexual exploitation. Windrush brought down a Home Secretary, but actually everybody in the community knew it was happening. Before it turned into a national crisis, people knew. They were just ignored. And there is something for me about, which goes beyond the scope of the inquiry I did, how do we capture that incredibly important information? Why did it take a UN envoy to come and tell us universal credit wasn't working? We knew stuff, and we find it really hard to get that transition into where decisions are made. But it's really important, valuable stuff, and we have to find a way of using it.
Yeah. Just before we bring this gent in, one of your observations on this, Julie, a number of local authorities are reviewing their community centres because they sit in very valuable land.
Yep. And
that is seen as a greater good than whatever social value, whatever term you use, the community centre provides. And just in terms of the estuary point, I sometimes wonder if part of the problem is the housing shortage. You know, if the police and the health workers lived in the community, when I first started, you might remember this, the director of housing in Leeds actually lived in a Leeds City Council house, yeah? His one luxury was he bought a new car every year, you know, because he had quite a normal salary. And in those days, the quality of local management was so much sharper because people just, they understood it. They didn't need a researcher or a consultant. It was just on their doorstep. And I think this chap had a point to make.
Well, can I just come in? I will come to that deep division in who lives where is a really important thing that we kept hearing about, and it's fantastically significant for how that gets translated. Given that we have it, we have got to find ways of translating the knowledge.
I wasn't taking away from the point.
Because we can't go back to it.
Did you have a hand up, sir?
Yeah, thank you. I think your comments about community centres are quite valid. Most of the time they're either underused or not used for the original purpose, or used by a small people of empowered people who keep the unempowered people out. Which leads on to my question: is an individual has no power, but until someone joins a group. Therefore, the group power then makes everything possible, and incorporation makes everything limitlessly unlimited. So, but forgive the pun. So, when you went round the country listening to these people, and you were listening to the willing, who were willing to speak to you, which may or may not be a very good indicator of how the community feels in its attitudes. So one of the things that I wanted to ask people is, do you think that putting social back in social housing is very important? And the second thing is, if you are looking to create communities of change and you're looking at place-based values or locality values, then you have to start with education of the rights and empowerment of the individual and the groups that are actually don't know that they are the most powerful. So you have to tell them before they can exercise that right.
That's really profound. I think so much in what you've said. Civil society, using my language, forgive me, is about how people do things together. That is the only way we ever get power, is by working together. And we have an incredible history in this country of doing that in ways that have changed the world. You know, we have changed things dramatically in this country, both at sort of the macro level, like, you know, the trade union movement has done that, all the way through to what's happened at an incredibly local level where people have got things done. I mean, I always used to say, I've never been to an area which has had a lot of public money for regeneration without finding a small group, nearly always women, I have to say, of very, very angry women who were driving it and who wanted things to change for their children and grandchildren. So what we do together, and I think the risk is, I think you were saying it, but it's become quite easy to dismiss that. We can talk about people who do that stuff as sort of busybodies and the usual suspects. You know, this is the lifeblood of our communities, is that people feel they can get together. But the reason I ended my talk about the risks of power just accruing to a few people is that people don't always behave well in those groups. And in every residents' association that is inclusive and brings people together and is responsive to new ideas, there are others who are bringing up the drawbridge, metaphorically or really, and saying, we don't want anyone new here. I think I talk about community centres not because I've got a fetish about community centres, but because I know people need places they can come together, where they come together as equals, where they're not divided. Everywhere commercial is divided by generations, by income, by how you get on. You know, we need places that we own in common. And you're right, I keep hearing people say this taking up valuable land. Unless you have a place to discuss and deliberate difficult things, where do you ever do that? Where do you get together? And I think how we invest in the places in which people meet really matters. And I think you might hear from Matt later.
Yes.
I caught you there. About I am.
That's right, yeah.
It's an old trick, Matt, but I always do it.
Yeah,
where people meet really matters. And then, final point, putting the social back into social housing. I'm old enough. It wasn't called social housing for a long time. It was housing. I think it's, you know, a whole other presentation, which I'm not going to give now because I'm not allowed to have the time, is, you know, what have we done that we've created the notion of people's homes and where they live, this most precious place, being somehow treated as something very special. Huge proportion of the population live in housing that they rent. Another part of the population live in housing which they rent off a building society or a bank usually, and they're trying to buy it. Actually, what we need is a sense that this is all incredibly valuable. This is where people put down their roots and where they live. And I've never liked the social housing term.
Oh, I think we have to draw a line under it there. So should we thank Julie again? Well done. Well done.